Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Topline's launch, Gender in Contemporary Europe, Rethinking Equality and the Backlash. These are results from round 11 of the ESS. So I'm delighted that we've got the members of the questionnaire design team here with us today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Susan Banducci to kick us off. Susan.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for all the support from ESS headquarters in helping to develop this module. We're very excited to be here today, myself and the rest of the members of the questionnaire design team, to present some of the top-line results. It's a very rich module, we think, with lots of interesting findings. So what we'll do today is just give you a very brief overview of some of those findings. We will also talk about initially our motivations and our aims and objectives in proposing initially this set of questions. And again, as I said, we'll talk briefly about some of the findings. And also as we go through, we'll talk about some of the ways in which we think the data are useful for the community of researchers working on issues around gender and gender equality, and how sociodemographics and how other attitudes drive these differences in perceptions of gender. So first, what I'd like to do is to introduce my colleagues who helped to design the module and the set of questions for round 11 of the European Social Survey. Amy Alexander at Gothenburg University couldn't be here today, but myself, I'm Susan Banducci at the University of Birmingham. Hilde Coffé is here from the University of Bath. Jessica Fortin-Rittberger from Salzburg is here, and Marta Fraile from the Spanish Research Agency is also here. So all of us contributed, of course, to the design of the module. What we'll do in the presentation today is I'll lead off with a discussion of our motivations and sort of the general themes of the module, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues to present on their sort of area of expertise within the module. Apologies in advance. We'll try to get this going as smoothly as possible, but I did, and we agreed that we wanted everyone to be able to speak to their areas of expertise within the module. So we will be going back and forth between presenters. But I'll start with talking about the motivations for the module. And generally, as researchers interested in gender and issues of gender and social and political attitudes, we noticed that there had been, of course, an increase and a progression toward more gender equal societies and more gender equality in politics. But we are also in a period of time where there is clear evidence of backlashes against this gender equality, clear evidence of narratives around the idea that gender equality has gone far enough, narratives around that gender equality and the progress of women and feminism were not good for society. So we thought it was time to really take stock of these questions and to do that in a cross-national way with high-quality data. And that's where we decided that something like the European Social Survey was an excellent platform to propose a set of questions that would help us tap into these ideas and help us address questions around gender equality, support for gender equality, and what was the evidence for a backlash against gender equality. So we thought it was important then at this particular time to ask these set of questions. So what we've done and what we did is to look at also at past measures of gender equality. And when you look at the past studies that do measure attitudes about gender and attitudes toward women in society, they do focus on the extent to which people accept equal participation of women in society, or they focus on whether certain roles are suitable for women in society. But generally, what's missing alongside these questions are the predispositions that might underpin these values or norms in society. And in particular, here we are thinking about issues around or psychological predispositions around gender identity and how rigid those gender identities are. Also, these cross-national surveys tended to focus on the role of women, as I've already suggested. So what are appropriate roles for women in a society rather than the role of gender or gender equality as a whole? As we go through our questions, I think you'll note that we do ask sometimes questions about the role of women, but it's also important to sort of continue to ask these questions so that we see how they line up against more general attitudes about gender and gender equality. So we have asked those as well. We also ask questions around gender discrimination and perceptions of gender discrimination in everyday lives of men and women. So we think that we add in these ways to the current existing surveys and cross-national surveys that ask about gender and gender equality. So we ask in the module 5 interconnected dimensions. We ask about feminine and masculine identities and how salient those identities are to individuals. And this helps us move beyond binary measures of gender and allows for more flexibility in the ways that people see themselves along gendered dimensions. So we ask about these identities in the survey. We also ask about hostile, benevolent, and modern sexism. And these are, and Jess will talk about these are predispositions and prejudice against women. And we have asked a set of 6 questions measuring that. We also ask questions about individuals' experience of gender-based discrimination and their perception of gender-based discrimination in society. We also ask about gender equality as a social value, so the extent to which individuals feel that gender equality in itself across different domains is good or bad to society. And we'll talk more in depth about what those questions are and how they're measured. And then we talk then we ask questions about preferences about gender equality policies in general. And these are questions that will allow us to get at what the extent to which people are willing to support or the lack of support around remedies to gender equality. And again, we ask about gender equality policies that would transform the role of women and men in the family, so in the private sphere, as well as transforming the role of women and men in the public sphere. So what we will do now is to give you an overview of what these questions are, and then some brief top-line results of what the data are showing us. So the first one, and I'll hand over to Hilde to present on this. Sorry, you'll have to.
Sorry, yeah. After so many years of Teams and Zoom. But thank you. What we do in this first part of the questionnaire, or at least of the presentation today, is measuring masculine, feminine traits or characteristics, and also self-assessed masculinity and femininity. So the aim was to move beyond gender as a binary measure, allowing us to investigate to what extent these identity influence some of our other measures that we are interested in, like support for gender equal policies or general attitudes toward gender equality, but also how they relate to other issues included in the core section of the European Social Survey, such as political participation. Now, how do we measure those items? So the first is that we ask respondents perceptions about how masculine and how feminine they feel. So it's a very general measure, and it goes from not at all to very much. And then we also look, it's somewhat based on the BEM scale. So we look at specific characteristics generally related to being masculine and being feminine. So I like to take risk. I like to be a leader, which are generally seen as masculine traits. And also I'm sensitive to others' needs and I act compassionately towards others, which are then more seen as feminine traits. So we don't see femininity as the opposite of masculinity, but because in theory one can score high on both. So we do see them as two different scales. And then we also have a question on gender identity, and that asks how important being a man or being a woman is to their way of thinking. Now, what we do show here, and Susan, I think you may go to the next slide, are some results and correlations between the different measures that we have. And what we see is that there are generally a relatively weak correlation between the traits and the general question of how masculine and how feminine do you feel. For example, you see that the correlation between lead and masculine is 0.21, between risk, that's between risk and lead. Between risk and lead, that's a relatively high correlation of 0.48. The same is when we look at sensitive and compassionate, the correlation is 0.66. So those items or those characteristics relate strongly, but they don't relate so strongly with the general question about how feminine and how masculine respondents feel. So we do see that the characteristics as such correlate, but not with a general measure of how masculine and how feminine respondents how they feel. But we do know from literature that those are also important items, and asking about femininity and masculinity is important, as in our own research, we have already shown that in particular masculinity relates to populist radical right voting, for example. So those items will allow us to move beyond that gender measure in a binary way and investigate in greater detail what extent characteristics related to masculinity and femininity relate to different characteristics.
Well, now we can turn to how we measured sexism in the survey. So what we did is included items that reflect three well-established forms of sexism: hostile, benevolent, and modern. And in turn, hostile sexism refers to overtly negative attitudes towards women. So for example, for us, we asked how often respondents believe that women try to gain power by controlling men, or women are too easily offended. Benevolent sexism, by contrast, involves seemingly positive but still stereotypical beliefs, like the idea that women should be protected by men or that they might be morally superior. These sound flattering, but they do reinforce traditional gender roles. And we did include modern sexism, capturing the denial or the belief that gender discrimination no longer exists. For example, we've asked whether respondents think women exaggerate claims of sexual harassment at work, or they think women are paid less for the same work. So turning to the next slide and looking at how these things are linked, the theoretical literature would tell us that we should see three distinct dimensions of sexism. And our dimensionality analysis does not confirm these three separate types of sexism and how people answered. Instead, the data point to one dominant dimension, mainly reflecting hostile sexism and one of the modern sexism items, together forming a relatively strong dimension of hostile sexism. So this is not concerning. It tends to replicate what researchers have found in individual countries, that this might be the dominant feature of sexism. And it is also the one that has been shown in research to be the most politically relevant, for example. So what we did for the next slide in the report is to build an index on these three items reflecting hostile sexism, to take a look at how much or how little sexism there is in the 24 countries we've included. And what's striking for us in most countries is that the average scores are near the midpoint, meaning that respondents feel that these beliefs or these sexist beliefs or behaviors happen at least sometime. So we don't have a wholesale rejection of these attitudes, but we have some broad degree of acceptance. That's quite interesting. What also is interesting is a gender gap or a gender split between men and women on these attitudes. But the differences are not always so dramatic. And in a few countries like the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Germany, women's scores are not actually so much different from one another. So this is also something that's different than what we had expected. But overall, what this tells us is that hostile sexist attitudes are fairly widespread and they're not exclusive to one gender. So the module really gave us the first opportunity to compare sexist attitudes across such a wide range of countries using harmonized representative data. So this is offering us a crucial baseline for understanding how sexism manifests and varies across contexts for research to come. So I will now turn over to the mic to discuss the perceptions of gender-based discrimination.
Thanks, Jess. The next set of questions, following on from perceptions and sexist attitudes, was to ask a set of questions about the extent to which people had experienced individual level discrimination. Those questions I have not put up on this slide, but there's a set of questions that ask in similar situations across healthcare, across the workplace, and across law enforcement, whether individuals felt that they had been discriminated against on the basis of being a man or on the basis of being a woman. And they reported whether they had never had that experience, or they had been discriminated against once or more than once. What we'll focus on here, and the idea in asking those questions was to get a basis for understanding how those individual experiences of discrimination could be mobilized either to increase the saliency of gender and to then be influencing people's attitudes about different policies or their attitudes about gender equality in general. So we thought it was important to capture those individual experiences to the extent that they might mobilize action against or for different policies. But we also then measured people's perceptions of whether or not they thought gender-based discrimination existed in society and the extent to which they thought it existed in society. And here we allowed not just for people to report on whether they thought women were discriminated against, but whether they thought men were discriminated against as well, or whether they thought men and women were treated equally fairly across these different domains. So across these different domains, we asked whether men and women were treated equally fairly, or whether or not women were treated more fairly, or whether men were treated more fairly in situations where they were seeking medical treatment, or where they were in the workplace. So whether men and women were treated equally fairly in terms of hiring, promotion, or pay. And then we also asked whether or not respondents thought that the police treated women or men less fairly, or whether they thought they were treated equally fairly. And again, this gives us an idea of the extent to which people understand or perceive unequal treatment on the basis of gender in society. So I don't have here reported all of these measures, but in general, what we found across the measures is that respondents overall thought that men and women were treated equally fairly in situations of the police as well, and dealing with the police. They also thought they were treated equally fairly on average in terms of medical and interacting in the healthcare environment. So generally, respondents thought that men and women were treated equally fairly. Only in the situation of the workplace did a majority feel that women were treated less fairly. So those are some overall findings from the data, in that people perceived that women were treated less fairly in the workplace, but generally equal treatment for men and women in situations of seeking medical treatment and in dealing with the police. However, for the police, and in dealing with the police, it was felt if people responded that women and men were not treated equally, um, they felt in situations of the police that men were treated less fairly than women. And this was approximately 14% would have said that men were treated less fairly than women. And that was higher than the proportion across both the medical and workplace. So what we're showing here in this figure is to focus in on that question about unfair treatment in police interactions, because this happened to be one of the measures where we also found some of the greatest divides across gender and across countries in terms of the perceptions of the fairness of treatment for men and women. And let me just explain what is shown in this figure here. For bars that are on the right, what that indicates is that on average, respondents in those countries felt that men were treated less fairly. And then for bars on the left, those are on average where respondents felt that women were treated less fairly. And then the bars are divided between men and women. In most countries, you'll see that men on average felt that men, or were on average, the modal response was that men and women were treated equally fairly. But where they're seen as treated, where there's unequal treatment, men tend to see that men are treated less fairly equally across in all countries. There are and women also tend to see that men are treated less fairly by the police as well, with a few exceptions. And those countries where there is an exception are countries like France, the United Kingdom, Cyprus, Portugal, and Greece. Um, we don't yet fully can explain or don't speculate yet on what might be driving those differences, but we do know that in some countries there have been high-profile cases where women have been shown to be ignored when reporting when they've been victims of sexual assaults or abuse. We don't yet know whether or not these are driving some of these differences, but we do see interesting differences and variations across countries in terms of this measure. I will also talk about perceptions of gender equality and gender equality as a value in society. Our motivation, again, for asking this question was to gain an understanding of how much value is placed on gender equality as contributing toward progress for society. And what we've done here is ask whether or not and how much good or bad gender equality is for society across different domains. So how good or bad is it for family life if equal numbers of women and men are in paid work? So that's a sense of how bad or good gender equality is for the private sphere. Then we ask a question about whether or not equal participation in positions of political leadership is good for politics in the country. And then we also ask whether it's good or bad for business, whether equal numbers of men and women are in higher management positions. And we also ask whether it's good for this or bad for the strength of the economy if women and men receive equal pay for doing the same work. What we've done here, because there is a high correlation on how people responded to these items, we have created a scale across these items to give us an indication of the overall support for gender equality as a value in society, and have plotted that across different countries by men and women. What we can see here, again, in the scale is where a high value is where there's a great deal of support for the idea that gender equality across these different domains is good for society, where the low end of the scale indicates it's bad for society. What we show is that there is a great deal of support for gender equality as a value. And this is across all countries, that responses are on average above the midpoint, where in general people think it's good for society. This is in contrast, of course, to the data that Jess presented on sexist attitudes in society. So we think that, again, it's a good juxtaposition with those other attitudes that represent orientations toward women's sort of participation or role in society and prejudice against women, though, and this question gives us a different look about support for gender equality as a value in society and whether or not gender equality is good or bad in society. So generally, there's a great deal of support across the domains of the family and the economy and politics that gender equality is good for society and good in these different domains, and it's not bad. But we do see, as we do on the other measures, that there's variations across countries. We do also see that there is a gap between men and women. So these are sort of interesting gaps between men and women across the country, and also interesting variations in the level of support. But we do note that there is a great deal of overlap between men and women in support, and also a great deal of support across countries. And again, this is in contrast to sexist attitudes. And another set of questions that we ask in the final is about preferences about gender equality policies. And I'll turn to Marta.
Okay, thank you, Susan. The final dimension is linked to attitudes toward policy responses to existing gender inequalities. And in particular, in the module, we asked respondents if they were in favor or against 4 different policies: parliamentary quotas, equal parental paid leave at work, and then 2 policies linked to the work life, which is the first one is finding business with a gender pay gap. And the last one is firing employees who make insulting comments to women in the workplace. So the respondents gave their answer on an ordinal scale ranging from 1, strongly in favor, to 5, and strongly against. So what we did to offer a general overview of the responses and the variation to these questions is to calculate support for each of the policy by using the proportion of respondents who strongly or somewhat favor each of the policies. Okay, so Susan, if you don't mind to jump to the figure. In this figure, which is divided in 2, because there are many countries, so there is one figure by country. We have calculated this average value of the percentage of people supporting each of the policy. So starting with the work dimension, which will be the green column, support for imposing sanctions on business that pay higher wages to men than to women for doing the same work. We see a high level of support across all countries. The average level of support is 68% of total respondents supporting this policy. And the countries showing the highest level of support are Spain, France, Iceland, Portugal, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, whereas the countries showing the lowest level of support are Slovak Republic, Hungary, and Lithuania. Now, if we move to the next column, which is the blue column, showing the support for the policy of firing employees, making insulting comments to women in the workplace, we see a similar level of high support. On average, the support is again 68% of total respondents providing support to this policy. And the range of variation across countries is relatively similar. So again, Hungary, Slovakia, and now Austria show the lowest level of support for this policy, while France, Spain, Slovenia report the highest level of support. This with regards to the, let's say, work dimension. If we shift the focus from employment to politics, we posit that the evidence somehow reflects the current political climate in Europe. If we now focus on the pink column that indicates the proportion of respondents favoring parliamentary quotas, the first thing is that we see is that the average level of support is smaller than in the previous case. It's around 54% of total respondents who declare supporting this policy. And another interesting pattern that we have found is that the lowest level of support are observed in countries showing the highest level of gender parity in Europe, typically Scandinavian countries such as Finland, Norway, or Sweden, but also the Netherlands or Germany. On the other hand, countries from the Southern Europe, but also Croatia, France, Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Italy show the highest level of support for parliamentary quotas. But it's still below those that we saw for the case of measures linked to work. Then now if we move to the private dimension, which will be the purple column that summarizes public support for a legal measure requiring both parents to make equal periods of paid leave to care for their children, we see that this is the policy that on average presents the lowest level of support in Europe, which is around 48%. And here again, we find the same similar pattern, interesting pattern, suggesting that the lowest level of support are found in countries with the highest level of gender equality. Again, Norway, Sweden, Austria, Germany, but also in countries such as Switzerland, Hungary, and Lithuania. They all show levels of average level of support below 50%. In contrast, again, we have Southern European countries championing the levels of support for this policy, such as Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy. Of course, we still need to analyze and think much better about this interesting pattern of that. It seems that there is an inflection point above which people start to think that perhaps levels of gender equalities in societies are enough, no? But we still need to explore this hypothesis. Overall, what we find in this descriptive analysis we have done is that support for gender equality policies varies across the three realms that we have examined: family, work, and politics. The evidence shows that while support for gender equality policies in the public sphere of work are more widely shared across countries and individuals, in the political sphere and in the private sphere, this is not the case. So this may suggest that the private sphere remains a significant challenge for gender equality policies. We know that still in Europe, women undertake the most levels of unpaid work in the household, for example. So all these policies that are linked to the way in which the work is organized inside the family may be challenging gendered social norms, and for that reason, the levels of support are smaller. We still need to think about this. Now we jump to the concluding section. I don't know if I will say some words, and perhaps Susan can add some other questions. we posit in that the contents of this module are particularly timely because the topics linked to gender equality are becoming more and more politicized in many democracies, not only in Europe, but also across the world. Our preliminary inspection of this evidence suggests significant variance at all levels between individuals, but also across countries, at least those countries included in the survey. This variance is particularly interesting because we're looking at advanced industrialized democracies that share certain characteristics. No? So all of these to us suggest that gender equality is becoming a central issue to ongoing contestation. We also think that with a more detailed analysis of this evidence, we will be able to contribute to many ongoing debates, such as, for example, the attitudinal antecedents of the emergence of the radical right wing, or the debate about, for example, the gender divide among young people, for which we think that we are still missing more rigorous and systematic and comparative analysis that we will be able to provide in the future. So we very much hope that this data collection will stimulate valuable research and will also foster an ongoing research agenda, encouraging continuous observation in future surveys. And I don't know if Susan wants to add anything else. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks. Well, I don't know if any of the other members of the questionnaire design team want to add anything. I would like to point out, or just as a final thought, is to bring together the questions and the data presented from my perspective. The questions and the distributions on the questions about gender equality as a value, where the support for gender equality and seeing that gender equality was a good thing for society across both private and public domains were quite high. But when we juxtapose that with your questions about the policy remedies about how to achieve gender equality, such as around parental leave, which address gender roles in the family and how those might be disrupted by gender equality, whereas you find support that gender equality in the workplace and women and men working is there's gender support for that, for equal participation, but around the policies where it would lead to gender equality in those domains, there is still resistance. So we find in general this idea about, a general support for gender equality, but then also some resistance to actual remedies to gender inequality. So those sorts of tensions, those tensions between general support for general gender equality as a value and how important it is to individuals, and seeing if it's a good or bad for society, the tension between that and the tension and support for actual remedies to that is one of the questions that we address in a book that we have forthcoming with Oxford University Press around understanding the resistance to gender equality. So what are the attitudinal, psychological resistances to gender equality that still are there, which may prevent us from moving to gender equal societies? It will also help us address where narratives around gender equality are inconsistent with what we are seeing. So we've seen narratives around how bad gender equality is for society and how bad it might be for business, or how bad it might be for the economy, and how bad it is for the family, particularly in how elites are mobilizing some of those narratives. Yet we are still seeing in the survey data a great deal of support for gender equality. So that's also something that bears further investigation, is, where we see that there are strong narratives around how the negative impact of gender equality on society, yet we still see a great deal of support for the notion of gender equality. I don't know if my other colleagues on the questionnaire design team would like to to weigh in, but and it's just been a great opportunity. The data, of course, are all available on the data portal with the most current release. And we hope that that's given you a flavor for some of what we see as some of the important findings so far across the data module. And I believe that there are some hands raised in the chat, and we are happy to address questions that people might have. I should say that we have done some additional analysis with the data. So we are able to speak more broadly to thematic questions that people might have about what we are finding in the data. We may not be able to ask or answer specific questions about countries or gender differences on individual items. But again, the data are available on the portal for further analysis. But we'd be happy to address any questions that those in the audience might have.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you indeed to all the team. Many congratulations on what's a beautifully designed module, where you very systematically managed to get a lot of themes covered in what I know is always a limited number of items that we allow you. So congratulations on that. Maybe as you were finishing, Susan, talking about that apparent juxtaposition between personal values and support for different policies, just start with a question from Mary Lisa, the nub of which is, do you think social desirability bias might have influenced how people respond to questions about support and general attitudes towards equality? Because of a lot of these touch on things that are broadly accepted values. You got any methodological reflections?
I believe one of my colleagues we have an answer to that. I don't know, Jess, you've unmuted. I will hand over to you to lead on addressing that first. Oh, Jess okay, sorry. I will address the question about social desirability. I think Jess maybe can't hear. Of course, on all of our questions, there was a concern about social desirability. And we think that potentially, or our first issue around social desirability, our concern was around the questions around sexism, for example. But what I don't think we're seeing any social desirability effects there necessarily, because people are still willing to say that they agree with an attitude that does express hostility toward women. So in one sense, those questions do not give us a sense of any social desirability for those items. But you are specifically asking around gender equality items that say, is gender equality good or bad for society? And yes, there might be the perception that people knew that gender equality is good for society. But we are still seeing, even if there is gender desirability effects there, we are still seeing variations across countries. So there is an extent to which the social context might be driving those social desirability effects. And we do see differences across men and women. So even if there are social desirability effects, that there might be, but we are still picking up variations across countries. I don't know if any of colleagues wanted to come in and respond to that, but it's something, sorry, Jess, did you? Now that you're, okay, sorry.
I think you've responded to this very well, that even if there were social desirability effects at play, they would be playing out equally across the different contexts. Therefore, they would be a constant that could be factored out and would not blur the variation across the countries that we have in there, which was the most important part that we wanted to capture.
And if I may add, also, well, we see that in the context, the current context, many people say that gender equality is not necessarily good for society. There is not such a social norm now. It's becoming less and less of a problem to declare this because we've got a lot of politicians making declarations and publishing posts in their social media profiles saying that. So more and more we think that this is not really a problem.
Thank you. A question from Evelis. Could you please clarify how masculine and feminine traits were defined in your study? Specifically, which conceptual frameworks or sources did you draw upon to operationalize these?
I'm happy to take that one. So we started from the BEM sex role inventory, which is obviously much longer than the 4 items that we included, but that was mostly due to space, that we were limited to to choose particular items from the scale, and we chose those ones which we, based on previous studies who had used the BEM scale, where we saw the strongest difference between masculinity and femininity. And then on top of that, the BEM sex role inventory, we also included the general questions about how masculine and how feminine people feel.
Thank you. Next question's from Joe. I think I can answer this. Just wondering what the age range of the participants responding to the survey is. So the window for ESS is 15 and up with no upper age limit. But I don't know if the team have done anything in terms of trimming. No, I'm seeing shaking of heads. So participants 15 up in households. Next question from Tylo. I beg your pardon, it's just disappeared off my screen. How are benevolent, hostile, and modern sexism related to general gender equality attitudes and values, since support levels are very different for those two concepts in the ESS data?
Well, obviously, the data that we have right now, we've just received it, and so the analyses that we've performed on these is rather preliminary at this time, and so we have taken a look at some of the cross association with these measures of sexism with other traits, and we can also draw on a budding literature taking stock of the linkage between hostile sexism, modern sexism, benevolent sexism with other political attitudes. The findings that is so far the most generalizable and robust across different settings is the powerful effects of hostile sexism on different measures on different measures of support for gender equality and also political behavior like vote choice for radical right parties. For modern sexism, the picture is a little bit more mixed, also with the items that we have included in the battery here. One of the items performs a little bit more differently than the other, the one on equal pay, and that's, will probably need to be analyzed separately. The findings across, about which generalization is most difficult in literatures on political science and sociology is benevolent sexism. Here, there are some findings that, that trace an effect on different attitudes and behavior, and there's a bevy of studies that find nothing. In the 2 items that we have included in the survey, there's very little correlation, which means that each of them is picking up something quite different about the concept. And so there, I think this is where we can push the research a little bit further and not confirm the bunch of studies on hostile sexism, but try to see, what are the different aspects of benevolent sexisms that can impact attitudes and behavior. So still a lot of research to do here. I don't have very firm answers, just more research questions for papers for you.
Which is always good. A quick follow-up from me on that. I was interested by this benevolent, hostile, and modern sexism sort of typology, and I wondered, to what extent do you see these as sort of flavors of sexism which continue to sort of exist and are maybe linked to other social and political priors, or to what extent could they also be seen partly as sort of generational flavors of sexism? So I was kind of thinking of benevolent as kind of 50s and 60s paternalism, hostile being the backlash against 70s and 80s feminism, and then modern sexism being a more kind of post-feminist, get over it type perspective. And so to what extent do you think there might be a trajectory, and to what extent just persisting flavors?
That's a good question. Well, if there are social psychologists in the audience, they're probably trying not to move on their chair too much. The social psychologists would say these are personality traits, and they're relatively fixed over the life course. And so this is something that will come in prior to values, to attitudes, political attitudes, to ideology, and to behavior later down the road. So that would be, one of the anchors we have in the survey that is not so movable across time. But the extent to which there's different flavors that come across generations is very, is very interesting. The scholarship on racism, for example, has done these sorts of analyses with like old style racism versus the sort of modern format. So there are indeed different kinds of ways in which these prejudices are expressed across time. And lucky for us, it's the first time we have properly comparable cross-national data, that does contain a large coverage in terms of generations, so that we are in a place to investigate these sorts of things. So I'm throwing another research paper idea at you instead.
Great, look forward to reading that. Question from Adrian. Do you think that a different question need to be drafted in relation to parental leave? Respondents are undoubtedly replying from an awareness of biological inequality, that women give birth and need to recover from that. This does not mean there is hostility to mothers and fathers sharing caretaking leave, i.e. following on from, post-birth recovery and breastfeeding leave, etc. And Adrian's from the Fraile Institute in London.
I'm happy to respond to that. Specifically, the wording of the question was the following. Imagine a couple who both work full-time and earn roughly the same amount and now have a newborn child. Both are eligible for paid leave if they stop working for some time to care for their child. So using this card, to what extent are you in favor or against a legal measure that requires both parents to take equal periods of paid leave to care for their child? So this implies that people supporting this policy is not against or is not considering the needs of the biological mother to recover from birth giving, etc. The question this is not a zero-sum game. The mother will take her paid leave for the first months, and then the question will be for fathers to get involved in taking care of the children. So this is our interpretation, that people who are against this measure consider this thing as a zero-sum game. It might be an implication, no? That this will imply that the mother will not take enough time for taking care, for recovering and taking care of her child. But it's not the case in this kind of measures. I don't know if this responds to the question. Thanks.
Thank you. I maybe can come back to Adrian if she wants to put something in the Q&A, but I've got other questions to come to first. So a question from Vera. Hello, Vera. Thanks a lot for developing this timely module. It's very inspiring for the work we're doing in another Horizon project, Men for Dem, Masculinities for the Future of European Democracy. That's a new one to me. Good to hear about that. A question about surveying this topic in the context of the gender backlash Have you encountered any challenges with this module in any specific country, for instance, say Hungary? And generally speaking, do you have any methodological suggestions for questions that can provide comparable data across societies that stand differently in relation to gender equality? So she's basically sort of fishing for, how do you manage potential cultural biases, etc.
I'll just jump in. Yes, and I saw the project and a description of the project. Fantastic, great project, and really looking forward to see what is produced there. I think we have learned just in general, methodologically, a lot from the ESS headquarters in terms of how to manage issues around translation, specifically related to gender. So and of course we have a lot to talk about around that could be a lot of new understanding way in which gender is used, and the differences in the use of it across countries and different languages. So I think we could share there some experiences there around questions. And I don't know if your question around outside of other countries means outside of the context of Western democracies, because I think I'm not sure that these questions specifically, as they're asked and as they're tailored, how well they travel outside of Western democracies and the countries contained within the European Social Survey. So I think that's a really good question, and one that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure if your countries go outside of Western democracies or European democracies. I've addressed two of the questions, but if anybody remembers and can pick up on the other ones.
Well, this I can also add this question about while we were designing the questionnaire, there are different languages who have different gender issues even in the way things are declined, for example, linguistically. So this adds additional complications to the design when you want to compare and if you're looking for equivalence across countries. So yeah, this is something you might have to consider too while designing your own questions.
Thank you, team. Can I just say in parenthesis, in addressing a question from the Q&A, there'll be a copy of this report and a link to this recording made available to all registered participants after this session. So yes, you'll get the materials. Question from Marta. Do you think it might be interesting to introduce a cross-country comparison to study how the emergence of the radical right and anti-gender movements might have affected gender resistance or resistance to gender policies?
Sorry. Go ahead, Hilde.
No, I just wanted to say yes. I think it would be very interesting to explore. That we obviously also know that populist radical right parties have there's also some differences in the anti-gender discourse of populist radical right parties, but I think that would be very interesting to see how that relates to gender resistance, etc. And we do know, because with the team we've written a paper on how sexism relates at the individual level then to populist radical right parties using Spanish data, so voting for Vox, and we did see a link there. So it would be interesting to also look more at the contextual level and see to what extent their discourse or where such parties are successful electorally, then whether they indeed that relates to differences in overall or in societal attitudes toward gender and gender resistance.
Thank you. Next question's from Oscar. Thanks you for your work on the module. Been looking into the country variation variation using bar graphs in how for how feminine or masculine men or women feel. Seems variation is mostly due to country level differences. There's almost no relation between age and feeling masculine, feminine within countries. Found this surprising given that current cohorts come of age in very different environments in terms of gender identity, etc. Your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, so we haven't explored this one yet, I think. We are also still, exploring the data. But I do agree that we could have expected differences. Then there might also differences between age groups and across countries. So I think there might also be various interactions. Also, how women and men, because we know there's a lot to do about young masculine men. So there might also be those interactions. So I think it's definitely something worth exploring in greater detail. Again, also looking at interactions, in particular, then also with gender and age, and then to what extent they feel masculine and feminine. Related and also again to those other measures that we have, and in like how they relate to gender resistance.
I'll just jump in here too, because there is a chapter that we've been working on for the British social attitudes, which will specifically focus on the case of Great Britain and these data, is that what we find in terms of age and these masculine, feminine identities and the gender traits is less rigidity in age. So younger cohorts have less rigid gender identities. So while you may be finding little correlation between age and femininity or age and masculinity, that when you actually are looking at the distributions, that younger cohorts tend to have less rigid identity. So they tend to be less polarized in their identities, less at the extremes, which may be hard to see in the correlations or when you're looking at each country, when you've got the data grouped together. But we would claim that and suggest that the way in which what we are finding is that there's less rigid gender identities amongst the younger cohorts. Of course, these vary by gender and across countries as well. But that's what our analysis of those age and gender differences by the gender identities has shown thus far.
Thank you very much. I think we'll make that a wrap. Can I express on behalf of all the participants our gratitude to the questionnaire design team for everything they've done on this module. It's a long, long journey, I know, but thankfully we're now seeing the fruits of your labours. Just a quick announcement for everybody else. If you like ESS top lines and you enjoyed this one, then I suggest you join us again on June the 16th for the top lines from social inequalities in health and their determinants. But for now, from ESS, it's goodbye and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.